There was a man who went out to sow. That is the opening of one of the shortest stories Jesus ever told. 8 words. And inside those 8 words is an image so common, so absolutely ordinary for anyone who lived in first-century Palestine, that nobody in the crowd would have raised an eyebrow upon hearing it. A man went out to sow, of course he did. That is what men did. That is what men had always done. And it is exactly that ordinariness that makes what Jesus does next so extraordinary. Because this parable is not simply about seeds and soils. It is about why the same message, the same truth, the same invitation falls on different people and produces completely different results. It is about what is inside the human heart that determines what grows and what withers. It is about vulnerability, about depth, about what happens when life puts pressure on what you believe. And 2,000 years after this story was told at the edge of the Sea of Galilee, it still describes with unsettling precision what happens to any important truth when it meets the real world, even in a fuel crisis in 2026. But we will get there. First, we need to understand the world where this parable was born. We are somewhere between the years 30 and 33 after Christ. The Sea of Galilee shimmers in the background. The crowds are so large that Matthew writes that Jesus had to get into a boat and push out from the shore so that everyone could hear him. It was a practical acoustic solution. The surface of the water acted as a natural resonance chamber, projecting the speaker's voice toward the crowd gathered on the concave shoreline of the lake. There were farmers in that crowd, fishermen, craftsmen, tax collectors, Pharisees watching from a distance, confused disciples in the front row, an extraordinary mixture of people with completely different stories, completely different expectations, and hearts at completely different stages of openness or closure. And Jesus looked at all of them and began with an image that everyone recognized immediately. A man went out to sow. Dr. Jody Magnus, archaeologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and one of the world's foremost specialists in the archaeology of the Second Temple period, describes what agriculture was like in first-century Galilee with a precision that illuminates every detail of this parable. Galilean agriculture in the first century was profoundly different from what we imagine when we think of modern farms. There was no machinery, no systematic irrigation, no effective pest control. The farmer depended entirely on seasonal rains, on the wind, on the quality of the soil he had inherited from his father, and on knowledge accumulated across generations about how to work that specific land. The sowing process was done by hand, with the farmer carrying a bag of seeds and casting them in a wide arc as he walked through the fields. It was a process that by definition was not precise. The seeds went where they went, and the soil of Galilee was notoriously varied, with areas of rich deep earth alternating with limestone outcroppings, hardened paths, and areas dominated by shrubs and thorns. Any Galilean farmer who heard Jesus describe seeds falling on different types of soil was not listening to a fantasy. He was hearing an exact description of his own weekly reality. Jesus described 4 destinations for the seeds the sower cast. The first destination was the path. Some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and ate them. The paths that crossed Galilean fields in the first century were not fenced or delimited the way we imagine roads today. They were strips of earth compacted by the constant traffic of people, animals, and carts. The soil in those strips was so hardened that a seed cast upon it had no possibility of penetrating the surface. It lay exposed, and the birds, always present in the fields during the sowing season, found it quickly. Professor Kenneth Bailey, who lived and researched in the Middle East for 4 decades, describes what that detail communicated to a first-century Galilean farmer. Any farmer who heard Jesus describe seeds falling on the path would know immediately what was going to happen. It was not a surprise. It was a certainty. The seed on the path had no future. The earth was sealed, compacted by years of use until it had become almost stone. There were no pores, no moisture, no possibility for a root to find something to hold onto, and the birds knew the fields as well as the farmers did. They followed the sower closely, watching where the seeds fell. The seed on the path lasted minutes, perhaps seconds. The second destination was the rocky soil. Other seeds fell on rocky places where there was not much soil. They sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered. Here Jesus is describing something very specific about Galilean geology. Galilee has large areas where limestone rock lies just beneath a thin layer of earth. This combination creates paradoxical conditions for growth. The shallow soil warms quickly in the sun, creating a warm microclimate that accelerates germination. And the rock below retains heat during the night, creating conditions that seem ideal for initial growth. A seed in that soil germinates faster than in deep earth. But when the roots search downward for water and nutrients, they find rock, and they cannot go further. Dr. Jody Magnus contextualizes that phenomenon within the agricultural reality of the region. Shallow soil over rock was a well-known problem for Galilean farmers. They had specific terms for different types of soil in their fields and knew exactly which areas would produce well and which were problematic. The rapid growth and equally rapid death of plants in shallow soil was not an abstract observation by Jesus. It was a phenomenon that any farmer in the crowd had personally witnessed. The plant in shallow soil looks healthy in the first days. Sometimes it looks more vigorous than plants in deep soil. But when the heat of the Galilean summer arrives, which can be intense and dry, the plant without deep roots has no reserves. It has no access to the moisture that sits in the deeper layers of the soil, and it withers within days. The third destination was the thorns. Other seeds fell among thorns. The thorns grew up and choked them. The thorns mentioned in the parable were not harmless plants. First-century Palestine had several species of thorny shrubs that grew aggressively in cultivable soils. They had deep and extensive root systems that competed directly with cultivated plants for the same water and nutrient resources. And they grew quickly, casting shade over smaller plants and blocking the light they needed. A field of thorns was not an abandoned field. It was frequently a field that had been cultivated, neglected for a season, and quickly colonized by those aggressive plants. The struggle against thorns was a constant and exhausting part of first-century agricultural work. Professor N.T. Wright examines what the image of the thorns communicated beyond its literal agricultural reality. When Jesus mentions the thorns, any first-century Jewish listener would have an immediate second association beyond the agricultural one. The thorn is one of the earliest images of consequence in the text of Genesis. After the fall, God tells Adam that the earth will produce thorns and thistles. Thorns carried a deep theological resonance in the Jewish imagination. They were the symbol par excellence of everything that hinders, chokes, and competes with what should grow freely. When Jesus uses this image, he is speaking simultaneously of a concrete agricultural reality and of a spiritual reality that his listeners recognized from Scripture itself. The fourth destination was the good soil, and other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. A final explosion of abundance after 3 images of failure. And notice what Jesus does not say. He does not say that every seed in the good soil produced 100 times. There is variation even within the good soil, 100, 60, 30. Success has gradations. The good soil is not uniform, but all the seeds in it produced something. Matthew then records something unique about this parable. The disciples came to Jesus privately and asked why he spoke to the crowds in parables. And Jesus explained, "This does not happen with any other parable in the same way. The prodigal son has no explanation. The good Samaritan has no explanation. The talents have no explanation. But the sower receives not only an explanation, but a reflection from Jesus about why he uses parables in the first place. And then he explains each element of the story. The seed along the path represents the one who hears the word of the kingdom but does not understand it. And the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. The seed on the rocky soil represents the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But he has no root in himself. He is temporary. And when tribulation or persecution comes because of the word, he immediately falls away. The seed among the thorns represents the one who hears the word, but the worries of this world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, and it becomes unfruitful. And the seed on the good soil represents the one who hears the word and understands it. This one bears fruit and produces 100-fold or 60 or 30. Dr. Amy Jill Levine, professor of New Testament Studies and Second Temple Judaism at Vanderbilt University, analyzes Jesus' decision to explain this particular parable and what it reveals about its function within his ministry as a whole. It is significant that Jesus explained this particular parable. It is, in a certain sense, the parable about how parables work. It is a meta-parable. It describes exactly the different types of receivers who were present in the crowd itself while Jesus was telling it. While he spoke about the seed on the path, there were people on the path listening. While he spoke about the seed in shallow soil, there were people with superficial enthusiasm around him. While he spoke about the thorns, there were wealthy people and people preoccupied with their businesses and properties in the crowd. The parable was simultaneously a description and a diagnosis, and the fact that Jesus explained it to the disciples privately suggests that understanding this parable was, for him, a kind of key. Whoever understood the sower would understand the principle behind all the others. But there is a dimension of this parable that is rarely explored in conventional interpretations. The sower keeps sowing. He does not stop when the seed falls on the path. He does not retrieve the seed from the shallow soil. He does not clear the field of thorns before sowing. He casts the seeds with the same wide and generous gesture, regardless of where they fall. From the perspective of a modern farmer, with a mindset of efficiency and resource optimization, that behavior would be considered irresponsible, wasteful, poor management. But Professor Kenneth Bailey offers a perspective that completely inverts that reading. In the agricultural world of the first century, the process of sowing frequently preceded the process of plowing. This means the farmer cast the seeds over the entire field, including the paths, the rocky places, and the areas with shrubs, before bringing in the plow to work the soil. What appears to be carelessness is actually the correct sequence of agricultural work in that region. The farmer was not wasting seeds. He was following the standard practice of his culture. And when Jesus uses that image, he is communicating something about the nature of the kingdom of God that goes beyond efficiency. The sower does not filter the receivers before sowing. He does not screen for who has the right heart before offering the seed. He sows generously, abundantly for everyone. And what happens afterward is determined by the nature of the soil, not by the sower's decision to sow only where it is safe. Now we need to talk about something that happened in 2026 that illuminates this parable in a way that no first-century theologian could have anticipated. In the early months of 2026, the escalation of the conflict between the United States and Iran generated a crisis in the global supply of oil, and as a consequence, a severe crisis in the price of diesel in practically every country in the world. Shipping routes were disrupted, maritime insurance costs soared, refineries recalibrated their operations, and the price of diesel, which is the fuel that moves trucks, tractors, harvesters, and the entire logistical chain of global agricultural production, rose sharply and without warning. The result was immediate and dramatic for the agricultural sector across different countries. Some rural producers, those with access to credit, financial reserves, diversification of income sources, and efficient operations, absorbed the shock. They adjusted their costs. They negotiated with suppliers. They maintained production. Others, those operating on narrow margins with high debts, with total dependence on imported inputs and no reserves to absorb sudden cost increases, saw their operations stop. Some stopped planting. Others planted but could not harvest for lack of fuel for their machines. And the impact of that paralysis spread through the food supply chain, affecting prices and the availability of food for entire populations. Professor Darren Acemoglu, economist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and specialist in economic development and systemic resilience, analyzes the pattern that external crises like this one reveal about the underlying structure of productive systems. What supply crises like the diesel crisis of 2026 reveal is not simply vulnerability to the external shock itself. They reveal what was already there before the shock arrived. A production system with deep roots, with reserves, with diversification, with structural flexibility, absorbs the shock and continues. A system with shallow roots, which grew quickly under artificially favorable conditions, but without building real depth, collapses when the shock comes. The crisis did not create the vulnerability. It revealed it. And that pattern repeats itself in practically every complex system we study, whether agricultural, financial, political, or social. The analogy with the parable of the sower is almost impossible to ignore. The diesel crisis was the scorching Galilean summer sun, and what it revealed was exactly what Jesus described 2,000 years earlier. The producers on the path, those who had never genuinely embraced sustainable practices, who operated in a completely superficial way without any reserves or planning, simply stopped. The crisis found them with nothing to hold on to. The producers in the shallow soil, those who had grown rapidly during the years of abundant credit and favorable conditions, but who had built their operations on fragile foundations without roots in their own technology, in diversification of inputs or in solid financial management, collapsed when the pressure arrived. They even appeared healthy while the environment was favorable. But they had no depth. The producers among the thorns, those suffocated by accumulated debts, by excessive bureaucracy, by multiple financial demands competing for the same resources, saw the crisis as one more factor in an already long list of suffocation. For them, the diesel was the drop that overflowed a cup already full, and the producers in the good soil, those with financial reserves, with access to alternative energy, with diversification of crops and markets, with efficient management and deep roots in their operations, not only survived. Some took advantage of the moment to acquire operations from competitors who had collapsed, expanding their presence in the market precisely because they had built depth in the previous years. Dr. Mariana Mazzucato, economist at University College London and specialist in innovation, economic resilience and public investment, reflects on what systemic crises reveal about the difference between superficial and sustainable growth. There is a persistent illusion in modern economic systems that rapid growth is always a positive signal, but rapid growth under artificially favorable conditions, without building real and deep capabilities, is frequently the precursor to equally rapid collapse when conditions change. What differentiates resilient systems from fragile ones is not the size or speed of growth under favorable conditions. It is the depth of the roots built during that growth. And the only way to test that depth is the shock. Crises like the one in 2026 are brutal and disruptive, but they are also revealing in a way that periods of prosperity never permit. Jesus described this with perfect precision 2,000 years before any economic theory of systemic resilience existed. The shallow soil produces rapid growth and equally rapid collapse when the heat comes. The good soil produces more slowly at first, but it produces in a way that lasts. Returning to the first century, there is one element of this parable that deserves special attention and that rarely receives the treatment it merits. The explanation Jesus gives for the shallow soil is not lack of intelligence or lack of goodwill. It is lack of depth. The one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, but has no root in himself. Notice that Jesus does not say that this person is evil, does not say that they are lazy, does not say that they are dishonest. They receive the word with joy. There is genuineness in the initial enthusiasm. Something real is happening. But when tribulation or persecution comes because of the word, they immediately fall away. The word tribulation here is thlipsis in Greek, pressure, compression, an external force that presses from the outside inward. And the word persecution is diogmos, a force that actively pursues, that does not leave one in peace. These are not imaginary or abstract forces. In the context of the first century Christian community, when Matthew wrote his gospel, tribulation and persecution were concrete and regular realities in the life of anyone who followed Jesus. There was real social cost in being a Christian. There was isolation from family, from community, from the synagogue. There was risk of violence in some contexts. There was economic loss in others. The lack of root was not a vague metaphor about spiritual depth. It was a description of how prepared a person was to endure real pressure. Professor N.T. Wright deepens that dimension of the parable with a perspective that connects the text to the specific historical context of its first reading communities. When Matthew compiled his gospel, probably in the 70s or 80s after Christ, the communities that read it had already experienced decades of pressure. The destruction of the temple in 70 after Christ had been a seismic shock for Judaism and for Jewish Christianity in particular. There was growing tension with the synagogues. There were internal conflicts within the communities. The parable of the sower within that context was not an abstract reflection on psychological types of receivers. It was a direct description of why some people who had embraced the message of Jesus with genuine enthusiasm had afterward retreated when the cost became too high. And it was also a diagnosis of why that happened. Not because the message was false, but because the roots were not deep enough to sustain the plant when the sun of pressure appeared. And then we arrive at the third soil, the thorns. And here Jesus does something surprising. He does not describe the thorns as obvious vices or gross sins. He describes two specific elements that choke the seed, the worries of this world and the deceitfulness of wealth, not the evil of the world, the worries of the world. not the corruption of wealth, the deceitfulness of wealth. Dr. Amy Jill Levine examines the specificity of those two images and what they reveal about the spiritual psychology Jesus was describing. Jesus is extraordinarily precise here. He is not describing people who deliberately chose the world over God. He is describing people who were gradually choked by things that in themselves are not necessarily evil. Worries are unavoidable in human life. Wealth is not inherently corrupt. But worries, when they multiply and occupy every available mental and emotional space, leave no room for anything else to grow. And wealth, when it becomes the organizing principle of life, when the central question becomes always how to protect and multiply what I have, creates an illusion of security that competes directly with any other source of security. The thorn does not attack the plant head-on. It chokes it through competition for resources. It is slow, gradual, and frequently imperceptible until the plant is already dead. Dr. Elsa Tamez from the Biblical University of Costa Rica offers a reading of that section from the perspective of the communities that originally received this text. For the poor communities of the first century who heard this parable, there was a painful irony in the mention of wealth as a choking thorn. Most of them would never have enough wealth to be choked by it in a literal sense. But Jesus uses a word far broader than simply money. In Greek, the text uses plautos, which can mean material wealth, but also everything that promises abundance and security. In the first century context, this included political connections, favors from Roman authorities, participation in commercial networks that required religious and social commitments conflicting with the Christian faith. For a poor person, the thorn was not necessarily money. It was the temptation to purchase social security at the price of their identity of faith. It was the offer of belonging to systems of power that demanded loyalties incompatible with what had been sown in their heart. And finally, we arrive at the good soil, the one who hears the word and understands it. This one bears fruit and produces 100-fold, some 60, some 30. 3 words in Greek describe this person: akouo, syniemi, karpophore, hears, understands, bears fruit. It is not an instantaneous process. It is not an explosion of immediate growth like in the shallow soil. It is a sequence: hears, understands, and then, as a consequence of understanding, produces. The word understands here, syniemi, is particularly important. In Greek, it carries the idea of bringing things together, of connecting elements that were separate, of seeing how the parts fit into a coherent whole. It is not simply memorizing information. It is integrating, assimilating, allowing comprehension to reorganize the way you see everything else. Professor Kenneth Bailey reflects on what that distinction between hearing and understanding reveals about the nature of the transformation this parable is describing. There is a tendency in religious interpretations to focus on the production of fruit as the main goal of the parable, but Jesus places understanding before production, and that is crucial. The fruit is not produced by an effort of will. It is produced by a transformation of understanding. When someone truly understands, in the deep sense of syniemi, the message of the kingdom, the production of fruit is not a commandment that needs to be obeyed with effort. It is a natural consequence of transformed soil, just as good soil does not need to be commanded to produce fruit. It produces because that is what good soil does when it receives a good seed. There is one final dimension of this parable that is rarely explored, and that, when understood, changes the way we see the entire narrative. Jesus is describing 4 types of soil, but he is the sower, and the sower does not stop sowing. After describing the hardened path, the shallow soil, the choking thorns, the sower of the parable continued his work. He kept casting seeds with the same wide and generous gesture, and eventually, inevitably, some fell on good soil. Dr. Jody Magnus examines what that persistence of the sower communicates within the context of Jesus' ministry and within the prophetic Jewish tradition that preceded him. In the Jewish prophetic tradition, the prophet frequently faces audiences that are not ready to hear. Isaiah is called to prophesy to a people who will hear but not understand. Jeremiah weeps over a generation that does not respond. Ezekiel speaks to dry bones, and despite all of that, they keep speaking. Because the mission is not determined by the receptivity of the audience, it is determined by the source of the message. When Jesus places himself implicitly in the position of the sower, he is positioning himself within that tradition. The question is not whether there will be hardened soil. There will be. The question is not whether there will be shallow soil or thorns. There will be. The question is whether the sower will stop sowing because part of the seed does not germinate. And the answer of the parable is no. The sower sows, and the good soil produces. But let us return to the contemporary analogy for a moment, because there is an aspect of the 2026 diesel crisis that the parable illuminates in a way that goes beyond economics. In the midst of the crisis, there was a response that drew the attention of analysts in several countries. Some rural communities that had invested years earlier in solar energy for their agricultural operations, in biodigesters that converted waste into gas, in regenerative farming practices that reduced dependence on external inputs, simply kept functioning when diesel prices soared. Not because they were wealthy or privileged. Many of them were small cooperatives with limited resources, but because they had built routes towards sources of sustenance that did not depend on a single supply chain. They had heard, understood, and produced. And when the scorching sun arrived, they had roots deep enough to reach water where others could not. Professor Darren Akamoglu returns for a final reflection on what the distinction between real resilience and the appearance of resilience reveals about how systems develop over time. The difference between a resilient system and a fragile one is rarely visible under normal conditions. During years of favorable conditions, both grow, both produce, both appear healthy. The difference only becomes visible when the shock comes, and then it becomes absolutely clear. The systems that invested in depth, in diversification, in capabilities that do not depend on a single external variable, continue. Those that grew quickly in shallow soil, fed by temporarily favorable conditions without building real depth, stop. And what is most unsettling is that often the most fragile systems are the ones that appeared healthiest immediately before the shock. Because rapid growth in shallow soil is visually impressive, until the sun appears. Jesus described that pattern in 8 words. There was a man who went out to sow, and what he sowed fell on different soils and produced completely different results, not because of the sower, not because of the seed, because of the depth of the soil. There is a question this parable leaves suspended in the air, in the same way that the parable of the talents does not let us forget the third servant, and in the same way that the parable of the prodigal son does not tell us whether the older brother went in or stayed outside. The question of the sower is not what type of soil you were in the past, it is what type of soil you are now, because unlike fields of physical earth, the human heart is not fixed. The hardness of the path can be broken, the rock can be removed, the thorns can be pulled out, and the soil can be prepared to receive what is still being sown. The parable is not a permanent diagnosis. It is an urgent invitation to ask, what is happening inside me with what I am receiving? What is preventing the roots from going deeper? What is choking the growth that has already begun? Dr. Amy Jill Levine offers a final reflection that captures what this parable continues to do 2,000 years later. What makes the sower one of the most powerful parables in the entire Christian tradition is precisely its refusal to simplify. Jesus does not say that everyone who hears is transformed. He does not say that the message is so powerful that it overcomes any resistance. He is absolutely honest about the fact that the same seed, the same sower, the same message, produces radically different results depending on what it encounters. And by being honest about that, he does something that few preachers dare to do. He places the responsibility back in the soil, not as condemnation, as an invitation. You can do something with the type of soil you are. You can prepare the ground. You can remove the stones. You can pull out the thorns. But nobody can do that for you. And the sower will keep sowing regardless of your response. In some time between the years 30 and 33 after Christ, a man got into a boat at the edge of the Sea of Galilee, pushed out a little from the shore, and began to speak. There was a man who went out to sow, and the people on the shore listened, each one in their own way, with the soil they had, with the stones they carried, with the thorns they had allowed to grow, with the depth they had or had not built. The diesel crisis revealed in 2026 that the pattern Jesus described does not age, that shallow soils still collapse when the sun arrives, that thorns still choke what could grow, that the hardened path still returns the seed before it can penetrate, and that the good soil, that which has been prepared with depth and care, still produces 100-fold, or 60, or 30, when the right seed arrives. The parable is not history, it is anatomy. It is a precise description of how human beings respond to important truths, and a permanent question about what you are going to do with the soil you have. If this journey back to the 1st century touched something in you, leave a comment telling us what stayed with you, which of the 4 soils you recognized in yourself. We read every single one. Next time, we are going to reconstruct the world of the parable of the 10 virgins. 10 women waiting for a bridegroom who is taking a long time to arrive, 5 with enough oil, 5 without, and a door that closes at the most unexpected moment. But when you understand what a Jewish wedding was like in the 1st century, what oil represented within the culture of ancient Palestine, why the bridegroom arrived late for reasons that any 1st century listener would understand immediately, and why the 5 virgins without oil could not simply borrow from the others, you will discover that this parable is not about superficial religious preparation. It is about what you carry inside yourself that nobody can carry for you. If you want to keep traveling back in time to understand Scripture the way its first listeners did, subscribe. Every episode, we go deeper.